how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News. Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, welcome to GB News Sunday on what is a rather sweltering day here in the capital. I hope it is very nice where you are too. I'm Emily Carver. For the next 2 hours, I will be keeping you company on TV, online and radio. So, coming up this hour, Rishi Sunak's allies are fighting back against Boris Johnson amid a growing Tory row. The former Prime Minister dramatically resigned as an MP on Friday over the outcome of the Partygate inquiry. Two of his allies have also quit with immediate effect. So Rishi Sunak now has 3 by-elections on his hands. What does this mean for him and the Tory party? Plus, according to a study by Migration Watch UK, if net migration is to continue at its present level and birth rates remain low, we could see the population increase by 16 million to between 83 and 87 million by the year 2046. I'll be seeing what impact that could have on the country, and clinicians and psychologists have welcomed NHS England's decision to ban puberty blockers for children suffering from gender dysphoria outside of clinical research. The move comes after a report into Children's Gender Services said there were gaps in evidence around the drugs. Common sense verdict there from the NHS, but first it's the news headlines with Rory Smith.
Thank you very much, Emily. A boat carrying British tourists is said to have burst into flames in the Red Sea. They were taking part in a scuba diving trip. The Foreign Office has confirmed it's in contact with Egyptian authorities and assisting those involved. 12 other Britons were reportedly rescued from the boat off the coast of Marsa Alam. Local media says 3 people are still missing. One of Boris Johnson's allies says the resignations of 2 Tory MPs was not a coordinated attempt to undermine the Prime Minister. Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg says there is no plot against Rishi Sunak and he believes he should remain leader. He also suggested Mr Johnson could return to Westminster, suggesting he could easily get back into Parliament at the next election. Well, the former PM announced he was stepping down as an MP after he was handed the findings of the Partygate inquiry. Sir Jacob says there could be a split if some MPs try to block his return, but he admits some things could have been done better.
One always deserves blame for one's own mistakes. It would be absurd of me to pretend that Boris hasn't made mistakes. There was a man called Peter Wentworth who in the late 16th century was locked up in the Tower for saying in the House of Commons, "None is without fault, no, not our gracious Queen." The same could be said of Boris. None is without fault, no, not our gracious Boris. That is true of all of us.
Well, meanwhile, Leave campaigner Nigel Farage believes it's the end for Boris Johnson with the Conservatives, but the GB News presenter told Camilla Tominey he's been talking to Tory MPs about potentially joining a new party.
The good side of Boris, of course, is, just look at today's newspapers.
Yes.
He's very good at dominating news.
Yeah.
He does have personality. He does make people smile. And if he wants to defend his Brexit legacy, well, I want to defend my Brexit legacy too. So would there be a possibility of a new coming together on the centre-right? It'd be Boris Johnson. There'd be other MPs that would join in with this as well.
Have you discussed this with Boris Johnson?
Not with him directly, no. But I have discussed it with people very close to him.
Well, in other news this afternoon, firefighters are battling a wildfire which reportedly stretches an area that's a mile long near Inverness. It comes as hot weather persists across the country. New yellow thunderstorm warnings have been issued by the Met Office, affecting parts of Scotland, Northern Ireland, England and Wales. They'll be in force until 9 o'clock tomorrow night. Ukraine says its counter-offensive against Russia is underway. President Volodymyr Zelensky says he's optimistic about regaining lost territory. It's after Ukraine said its forces had advanced up to 2,000 metres along the front line near the eastern city of Bakhmut, while Russia is disputing those claims. Homeowners are being hit with what Labour is describing as a Tory mortgage penalty of £7,000 a year. The party says interest rates are triple what they were 2 years ago, and the average homeowner is paying an extra 150 quid a week as a result of the mini-budget. The government says it's working on halving inflation to help struggling households. The government has announced £58 million of funding to help people with health conditions get back to work. 25,000 people in England will benefit from the scheme and will be referred to the service by GPs. Well, the funding will help them start or stay in jobs by March 2025. DVLA workers have started their 2-week strike action in the long-running civil service dispute. Members of the PCS union are taking action at Typhelan and Swansea, which is likely to lead to backlogs for driving licences. The union has been given an improved offer to end the dispute, including the promise of a £1,500 payment to each member. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now, though, back to Emily.
Thanks, Rory. So our top story, Rishi Sunak now faces 3 by-elections after Boris Johnson and his allies Nadine Dorries and Nigel Adams resigned with immediate effect. Boris Johnson believes he has been the victim of an establishment stitch-up, but has his support within the party and in the country run out? And what does this all mean for Rishi Sunak, I wonder? Will he be able to put the Boris drama behind him and unite the party behind him? Doesn't look likely where we're standing now. And as for Boris Johnson, what will he do? Is a comeback on the cards? Do you think he's been a victim of a technocratic coup? Or is it time he hung up his political gloves for good? He's unlikely to disappear, that's for sure. So joining me now to discuss this is our deputy political reporter, Tom Harwood. Tom, Rishi now faces 3 by-elections. Can we expect any further resignations?
Well, that is the speculation and the whispers on everyone's lips in Westminster. It's a very curious position for the Prime Minister to have found himself within the space of 24 hours from Friday through to Saturday. 3 by-elections, one defending a majority of 7,000, one a majority of 20,000 and one a majority of 25,000 votes. Now, in normal times, a by-election to defend a majority of around 25,000 votes would not be an issue for the Prime Minister, but these are not normal times, and we have seen in recent history similar scale majorities be overturned by very coordinated and concerted by-election efforts. And it is of note, it is of interest that the Conservative Party have this weekend called upon their entire candidates list, everyone who has applied to be a candidate anywhere in the country for the Conservative Party. They are now being told, get to mid-Bedfordshire to help the canvassing and campaigning effort. Now that points to perhaps some worries in Conservative campaign headquarters, perhaps some jitters, fears that they might not be able to hold on to what is notionally a very safe Conservative seat there in mid-Bedfordshire. And the question arises, why is this happening? Why these 3 by-elections from 2 very close allies of Boris Johnson and one Boris Johnson himself? Why so suddenly? Why altogether? Some people have raised the question of whether or not this is a coordinated attack on Rishi Sunak's authority, although Jacob Rees-Mogg has said that he does not believe this is a coordinated effort.
I'm afraid I think this plot for lots of people to resign is invented. I think two people decided they wanted to leave Parliament, both of whom had indicated that desire already. They've just slightly changed the timetable, both of whom were expecting to retire to peerages rather than to the Chiltern Hundreds. I'm unaware of any plot of this kind. It's speculation not based on sufficient evidence.
Rees-Mogg says that he's unaware of that sort of plot and does point correctly to the fact that both Nigel Adams and Nadine Dorries had said they'd be standing down anyway at the next general election. However, what both Nigel Adams and Nadine Dorries had also said is they wouldn't stand down until the next election. So clearly what has happened in the last couple of days is a change in position from those two individuals, from standing down in 2024 to standing down in 2023.
Tom, if there is some kind of coordinated plot, it doesn't seem to be a very big one. We've only had Nadine Dorries and Nigel Adams follow Boris Johnson and resign. I have a sense that perhaps support for Boris Johnson within the party is waning. It seems to be petering out. Is that what you're hearing on the ground?
Well, it's certainly true that Boris Johnson isn't as popular in the Parliamentary Conservative Party as he once was, but there is another side to this. I've spoken to some allies of Boris Johnson in Parliament who have said that they absolutely will not be resigning their seats in Parliament, because if Boris Johnson were to ever make a remarkable comeback, he would need allies still there on those green benches. So potentially it would be an act of folly for him to sort of rid the parliamentary party of all of his allies at just the time when he would need allies in the parliamentary party. Perhaps that suggests less coordination than much speculation points to. Clearly, all MPs are individuals, have their own ideas in terms of how best to advance their principles or indeed their favoured candidates. And certainly one or two of those that I've spoken to who have been the subject of speculation, will they stand down at all or before the next election or at the next election, some of those I've spoken to have said that that would absolutely be the wrong thing to do.
And Tom, just lastly, a little more speculation, if you will indulge me. Boris Johnson, what will he do next? We've heard from Nigel Farage earlier on today on the channel, talks potentially. Perhaps he would work with him, a new centre-right party. Is this all just whispers? Is this all just hearsay?
It's very entertaining whispers, but I'm not sure that that would be at the top of Boris Johnson's list. At the moment, what seems to be the top of Boris Johnson's list is keeping his profile high and making rather a lot of money. He's on this speaking circuit tour at the moment. He's spoken in many countries around the world, and people do pay him quite a lot for his time. So I think we should expect to see many Boris Johnson speeches popping up, speaking to different audiences around the world, raking in a lot of money on that speaker's circuit, but also potentially returning to some sort of media role in the United Kingdom, perhaps that before any more politics. There's been a lot of speculation as to whether he will return to an old gig he had at The Spectator, or might The Telegraph have room for him too? Perhaps even some sort of broadcast outing. Who knows? Clearly, there is much speculation in terms of how Boris Johnson will remain part of the national conversation. What there isn't speculation or what there isn't contention about, perhaps I should say, is that he will for certain continue to be part of that national conversation.
Well, hopefully Boris Johnson won't swoop in and steal my seat, but there you go, on the GB News presenting seat. Thank you very much indeed. Tom Harwood there, our Deputy Political Editor from a very sunny South London. I think he'll be joining me in the studio later, hopefully, as well. But joining me to react to that is barrister and writer for The Spectator, Stephen Barrett, and former Labour MP Shaun Woodward. Well, there you go, Stephen. Boris Johnson could be joining The Spectator.
Well, I mean, he was there before. What Boris does and what Boris doesn't do is really a matter for Boris. And I think that what is particularly interesting and what the country might want to turn its attention to is the manner of his removal. because we have had in this parliamentary committee what some people call it a kangaroo court. I have rather more respect for kangaroos. And I prefer to call it a show trial because I think that gets to the nub of what has happened. Effectively, non-law or a sham of law has been used to force a member of parliament to resign by people who are his political enemies. And I can say that because of what they did. And I'll take your audience through that. I'm very happy to go through the detail. But of course, to the ordinary viewer, that might sound dramatic or hyperbolic, because they would instinctively trust Parliament and believe that Parliament had behaved in an honourable or just way. They wouldn't understand that Parliament rewrote the definition of the wrong after they said that it had occurred. They would expect that Parliament was investigating whether Boris Johnson intentionally misled Parliament. The ordinary public would not assume that Parliament had simply thrown that out the window and said, "Oh well, we'll invent this new idea that you can sort of recklessly lie. You can, oh yes, that'll be terribly exciting."
But Stephen, sorry to interrupt, but people would say, when they hear you say this, they would say, well, it's a committee that has many Tory politicians on it too. Is it all a stitch-up, or is Boris Johnson the architect of his own demise here? He's not a victim.
Well, what matters is to always, and often when Boris is involved in the story, he does rather cloud things, because as Tom Harwood rightly said, he's a major force for attention. What has been happening would be unjust if it happened to any MP. It would be utterly unjust if it happened to any of us. And it can't happen to any of us because we're not inside Parliament. Outside Parliament, we have courts and we have justice and we have the rule of law. What the Parliamentary Committee did was drive a coach and horses through all of them. Now, it can do that because of the Bill of Rights in 1689. That means that the courts can't make Parliament behave. So you've really got to think of Parliament like a sort of a house where the parents have gone away and they've decided to behave. They can't be told what to do. So they've decided how they will behave, and they're now behaving in this reckless way that is completely outside the rule of law.
Stephen, I think a lot of people would have sympathy with that view and agree with you wholeheartedly. Shaun Woodward, former Labour MP, what is your reaction to what Stephen said there? Because there are people who do think there is an establishment stitch-up at play here. They may also think at the same time that Boris Johnson should hang up his political gloves.
I think you're in danger of all talking to yourselves. I mean, out there in the country, Boris Johnson is history. It was a majority of Conservative MPs that actually controlled the House of Commons. They could have stopped this going to the Privileges Committee. The Privileges Committee is 7 members. It's 4 Conservatives to 3 others. I mean, at the end of the day, if Boris Johnson, and we know Boris well, he's an extraordinary person in so many ways. But if Boris actually thought that he could win a by-election, even if that's what would have been the outcome of all of this, he'd have stayed. He knows he can't because the country gave up on him and it's moved on. And I think what's slightly extraordinary about this conversation is it's in danger of stuff for the birds. The country now, if we look at all the polls, is giving the Labour Party a whacking great lead. Rishi Sunak is doing his best to try and hold on and rebuild confidence in the government. At the same time, the Conservative Party has launched now into a combination of a nervous breakdown and civil war. Everybody for themselves, running for the lifeboats, the men pushing the women and children away to get on the boat first, to cause a by-election. If you care about your political party, how on earth do 2 more people on top of Boris Johnson help the Conservative Party win the next general election? All I can say is that this is now a spectator sport. People like me in the Labour Party, to some extent, really just need to sit back and just watch the fireworks go off. Because what Stephen says is very interesting, but it's detached from the real world. Boris Johnson is not popular in the country. If he was popular, we know Boris, he'd stand, and because he believes he could win. The reason Boris isn't standing in his seat in a by-election, fair or unfair, caused by the Privileges Committee, is he knows he can't win.
I mean, Stephen, coming back to what Sean said there, he's right. Boris Johnson.
No. I mean, that is his personal opinion.
But his popularity ratings aren't exactly sky high at the moment, are they? And people within the Conservative Party too, Conservative members too, don't want Boris Johnson to reappear as leader anytime soon. There's polling from Conservative Home to back that up. Stephen, are you at risk of living in the past here?
No, I mean, I'm certainly not, because I'm not arguing for or against Boris Johnson. What I'm saying is that the rule of law matters, even if unjust things are done to unpopular people. I mean, if Boris Johnson was suddenly the least popular person in the world, it would still matter to law and justice that the chair of the committee, Harriet Harman, had found him guilty before the committee made up its mind. She had publicly stated he was guilty. It would still matter that they had rewritten the offence. It would still matter that 3 members of the committee voted for Margaret Ferrier to receive a 9-day suspension, and yet conveniently we are told that Boris was to be given a 10-day suspension for what is, on any objective analysis, a lesser offence. And it would always matter, I mean, whether you care about this stuff is your personal political opinion. So when I say matter, I'm not trying to say you have to parade in the streets and actually care. But I'm not ever going to stop pointing out a show trial. If it was to this gentleman and he was still an MP, he can rest assured I would be telling the world it was a show trial of him.
It would
he was
all be
popular
true.
or not.
Well, Sean.
No, Emily, it's a really important point here, because you can lambast Harriet Harman as much as you want, but there are 4 Conservatives of the 7 members on this committee. And when I was last at school, 4 is a majority, right? If the 4 members of the Conservative Party share Stephen's view, then it doesn't matter what Harriet Harman thinks. But they don't. And what I think we're going to see here is, I'm afraid, it's the end. And I think for me, what's sad, and I'm old enough to have been around when Margaret Thatcher went, and I was then a BBC journalist. But I have to say to you that what's interesting here is Boris has brought this about for himself. But crucially, Mrs. Thatcher arguably brought about her own downfall too. But the way she went was with extraordinary dignity. And I think what is really most striking about what's happening right now is this is sort of like Wagner's Twilight of the Gods. I mean, the pillars of the temple are being torn down by Boris and those around him, like Nadine Dorries. And instead of this man going, he's been Prime Minister, he deserves some respect. But at the moment, people like me might be prepared to give him respect. He's so busy tearing it all down. So we're now commenting on that. And I think forever in my mind will be that last debate after Mrs. Thatcher went in the House of Commons when Dennis Skinner stood up to attack her. And she responded to Dennis Skinner by saying, I'm enjoying this. And she had the support of the whole House. And what is extraordinary in this moment, in this Twilight of the Gods, Wagnerian, Shakespearean moment, is that Boris, instead of going like a dignified Prime Minister, is simply saying, I'm going to sink the boat. And that is what is so extraordinary. And I think what history will actually recall here won't be the interstices of Harriet Harman and the Privileges Committee. It will be how somebody who has been Prime Minister of our country, he's been our Prime Minister. I'm a Labour politician, but he's been our Prime Minister. What is going to, I think, be very sad here is how he leaves.
Well,
and that, I think, is really, for the long term,
we shall see
what history will judge him on.
I'm very interested to that fantastic discussion there. I'm very interested to see what our viewers think. I think they're very divided on how things have gone down when it comes to Boris Johnson and his resignation. Thank you very much indeed to both of you. Labour MP, former Labour MP Sean Woodward, and barrister and writer at The Spectator, Stephen Barrett there. Whew, lots to get stuck into there, and lots of you have been getting in touch already. David has to say, the problem with Boris is he fudged his way through politics and has always been economical with the truth. Steve says if Boris forms a new party with or without cakes, it will only be a project to generate a politician's salary. Such a party could never be large enough to form a government. Probably true. Pam says, Nigel and Boris, you are this country's only hope. Well, there you go. Keep your views coming in. Please do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter. We're at GB News. You are watching and listening to GB News Sunday with me, Emily Carver. We've got lots more coming up on today's show. A study by Migration Watch has found the UK population is on course to rise by nearly 16 million by 2046 at present levels of net migration. Are we prepared? Can we be prepared for this sort of rise? See you after the break.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway,
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News. Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to GB News Sunday with me, Emily Carver, on your TV, online and radio. So a peaceful protest is taking place in Portland today against Bibby the Barge, which is to be used to house asylum seekers off the Dorset coast, armed with kayaks and paddle boats, sending their message across both land and sea. So let's cross straight to Portland to get the very latest from the protest with GB News Southwest reporter Jeff Moody. Jeff, what's going on down there?
Well, yes, another day, another protest here in Portland. We're expecting the Bibby Stockholm barge to arrive on, I think, the 17th of June, so it's not coming quite yet. But when it does come, it will dock just behind us here in Portland Port. They're saying that to start with, there'll be 50 migrants on board, and then that'll gradually rise month by month until we get the full quota of 500. Well, the people of Portland have been out in force today to say no to the barge. Alex Bailey is one of the organisers, the main organiser of the event. Alex, you're getting a lot of support locally, a lot of people very angry still about this. Do they feel that they're being heard?
No, they don't. The last meeting with the Portland Town Council on Nationally though, there have been a lot saying no to the barge. I'm aware that Sadiq Khan, Mayor of London, has been offered but declined. Now that is a city of millions. How can they not bring what is 1,000 asylum seekers into their infrastructure, while as this community is 14,000? How are we meant to absorb the 500?
And Portland Port is right in the centre of Portland, isn't it? They literally, you walk out of the port and you're straight in the middle of a high street, you're straight in the middle of houses. Talking to a lot of people here today, there's a great deal of concern about the way these people are going to integrate in a community down here that really isn't diverse at all, is it?
I would agree, Jeff. Just thinking about the area itself, the only mosque that we have is a very small one, and that is in Weymouth itself. The community here, though, it is not prepared. It is not diverse. It does not have the amenities, the restaurants, the culture that these would be used to. Now, that has yet to be addressed. There are going to be buses put on, but for a small mosque to be able to handle what could be up to 506 individuals looking to worship, it's not enough.
Alex, thank you very much indeed. And of course, it's not just the mosque and their places of worship, it's also how they're looked after in terms of healthcare as well. There are 2 GPs on the island, and people are saying, well, how are they going to be able to cope when they've got an extra 500 people to look after? There are more protests planned down here in the coming weeks and months, and although the barge isn't due here till the 17th, there is still a hope amongst the people here that something can be done and they can say no to the barge and actually be heard. Back now to you in the studio.
Thank you very much indeed, Jeff Moody there, GB News South West reporter. It does seem like locals are rarely heard, but they're making their voices heard with us anyway. Now, moving on to something related, according to Migration Watch, a study by Migration Watch, if net migration continues at the present level and the birth rate remains low as is, the population could increase between 83 and 87 million by 2046. That comes as recent figures show the number of new homes granted planning permission in England has collapsed to its lowest level since the 2008 financial crisis. Go figure, how does this all add up? How can you have a huge population increase and not even build houses? So joining me now is immigration consultant Dean Morgan. Dean, thank you very much indeed for joining me. Your reaction to this study that shows if migration levels stay at the level they are now, we could see the population explode.
Yeah, I mean, it's shocking, let's be honest. I mean, the story that came, preceded this one, is a microcosm of the problems that we face in the UK. I mean, all of it links back to government, in my opinion, and government policy. How can you not build enough houses? The housing problem, I'm 44 years old, born in 1979. And there's always been a housing crisis in this country. One reason possibly could be that the people in power are the largest landowners and housing owners in the country. They don't want to dilute their investment. I assume that's the reason for whichever party comes in, we have the same problem. And then with net migration at 606,000 last year, I mean, that's just not sustainable.
I mean, Dean, not to venture into conspiracy, but do you think it's deliberate that the government has migration at such high levels?
You can only claim incompetence for so many decades, can you not, before you have to start looking for other reasons? There's never been enough housing stock since the end of the Second World War with the rebuilding and moving everyone out of London. So why are we in 2023, the year it should be Jetsons, I was told when I was growing up in the 80s, and there's still a housing crisis, a migrant crisis, a cost of living crisis, an NHS crisis. I could keep going, couldn't I?
Well, yes, and what other things would be impacted by such a rise in population? Because this is 2046. Now, this, of course, is if immigration levels stay at where they are, and that's a big if. It may be that the government and future governments decide to clamp down quite hard, although there's no real indication to suggest that that will happen. But what other implications are there? Of course, there's implications on social cohesion, also things like water, transportation. We've mentioned housing, but what else?
Well, obviously, you have to get rid of social welfare because, I mean, we're 2 trillion in debt. I mean, the Bank of England and the government decided to make the money printer go brrr, which just led to hyperinflation or leading to it. And so that's led to the cost of living crisis. You know, there's too many pounds chasing too few goods and services. I'm not an economist. I'm not a government minister. But again, you and I could sit here today. We could probably get a piece of paper and start putting a lot of this right. I mean, those figures on the 606,000, there is a caveat there. Ukraine is an extraordinary event. And so was us having to pay on the deal we made with China in 1997 to accept people that didn't want to accept CCP role. So take them out, but the dependent side of things is shocking. But the thing that disappoints me the most is that this isn't going to change, because I can't see how any leader, you know, we've got an unelected prime minister right now for a start, and who's going to come in and change this? I mean, Keir Starmer's policy is to go and destroy the environment in the Greenbelt land, you know, start building on Greenbelt. We've only got to drive through East London to see all the land, you know, the landowners that don't develop. So many different innovative ideas could be used here. You could have trade deals where you could say, we're not going to trade with another country unless they accept their people back. And that would then mean that people don't have to be dumped off in Central Africa, which is more.
Well, that's a very interesting idea, Dean, because we have the government scrambling around for these agreements with other countries. There needs to be an incentive, and a financial one is, of course, probably the best way to go. Thank you very much indeed. That's all we've got time for. Sorry, Dean. Dean Morgan there, immigration consultant, talking us through those shocking reports. Well, a study from Migration Watch saying that the population could increase by 16 million people by 2046 if immigration stays at the levels it is now. Well, you're watching and listening to GB News Sunday with me, Emily Carver. We've got lots more coming up on today's show. The Duke of Sussex has landed back in Los Angeles after his flying visit to the UK to give evidence, of course, in his High Court phone hacking case against Mirror Group newspapers. It's been a bruising week. What's next for the Prince? But first, let's get the news with Rory Smith.
Thank you very much, Emily. We're going to start with some breaking news. And 6 boys and 2 girls have been arrested on suspicion of murder after a 16-year-old was stabbed in Bath yesterday. Avon and Somerset Police says a 35-year-old woman was also injured. The arrested children are between 15 and 17 years old. We'll bring you more on that as we get it. Well, in other breaking news, 3 British tourists are missing after a dive boat burst into flames in the Red Sea off Egypt. Officials say 12 Britons were rescued, along with 12 Egyptian crew and guides. The Foreign Office has confirmed it's in contact with Egyptian authorities and assisting those involved. Well, in other news this afternoon, one of Boris Johnson's allies says the resignations of 2 Tory MPs was not a coordinated attempt to undermine the Prime Minister. Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg says there is no plot against Rishi Sunak and he believes he should remain leader. He also suggested Mr Johnson could return to Westminster, saying he could easily get back into Parliament at the next election.
One always deserves blame for one's own mistakes. It would be absurd of me to pretend that Boris hasn't made mistakes. There was a man called Peter Wentworth who in the late 16th century was locked up in the Tower for saying in the House of Commons, "None is without fault, no, not our gracious Queen." The same could be said of Boris. None is without fault, no, not our gracious Boris. That is true of all of us.
Yellow thunderstorm warnings have been issued as temperatures continue to climb across the country. The Met Office says the alerts affect parts of Scotland, Northern Ireland, England and Wales. It'll be in force until 9 o'clock tomorrow night. Temperatures are expected to hit 32 degrees today. That's the up-to-date, but you can get more on all of those stories by visiting our website at gbnews.com.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
is the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, The People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.
Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, The People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Welcome back to GB News Sunday with me, Emily Carver, on your TV, online and digital radio. So, football. Manchester City have won their first ever Champions League and the treble after a 1-0 win over Inter Milan last night in Istanbul. Rodri scored the only goal, capping an unforgettable season for Pep Guardiola's side. There you go. Joining me now is sports broadcaster Aidan McGee. Tell me, what's the significance of this then?
Well, look, you're a Man United fan, you're probably not old enough to remember them doing the treble in 1999. That was a huge, huge thing. Local players coming through. Beckham, well, he wasn't local, but he was still English. He came through the youth system. Nicky Butt, Paul Scholes. They had charismatic players all over the team, and they just pushed themselves over the line in the face of some enormous competition. Different slightly for Manchester City. They've been knocking on the door for a number of years. They've underperformed in Europe. You couldn't say that of Man United back in '99. They'd been threatening to get to finals for a few years prior to that. But this time they failed 2 years ago. Last year they got to the semi-final, had a big chance to do it. Pep Guardiola said afterwards it felt like a massive relief because for prestige purposes, Manchester City really needed to win the Champions League and to do the treble. As I was going to say, it was unprecedented in English football. It's not quite unprecedented because United done it, but it does not happen very often, Emily, at all.
Well, no, and many disappointed Manchester United fans out there, I am sure. I say I'm a fan of Manchester United. I mean, my family have always supported Manchester United. I have actually been to Old Trafford, though.
Yeah.
At one point when I was very young.
I had my own parking space there once.
Used to go to Wembley sometimes for England matches.
Yeah.
Always good.
Yeah.
So tell me something else. What else do we need to know about the football?
Well, I mean, look, it wasn't a great performance by City, but sometimes that's just how it goes. They rode their luck a little bit. When you win the major honours, you can't really do it without a slice of luck. Having said that, luck aside, the best team won the tournament. This is the best collection of footballers at any club side. Arguably in the history of the game. You could measure them up against Barcelona in 2011, also managed by Pep Guardiola. Guardiola set
Greatest manager of all time?
Well, possibly. I mean, he hasn't won the highest number of Champions Leagues, but in terms of how he's changed the game and how he's influenced so many managers, and I think you'll see in the next 10 years, players who played for him, even some of the ones who played for him right now, may turn into Guardiola Mark II. So an extraordinary personality. He's been there since 2016, so it's taken his time, but goodness me, when he finally did it, that team, I mean, they put 4 past Real Madrid in the semi-final, they put 4 past Liverpool in the league, they put 4 past Arsenal, they put 6 past Manchester United earlier in the season. This is an extraordinary side.
Now, Now, I find from talking to people who are massive football fans that it's not just about the football, is it? It's about all the drama behind the scenes, all of the changes, the chopping and changing.
Well, the money, it's the money
who's
as well.
buying which players,
yeah, transfers,
where the money's going, transfer season, etc., etc. Is there anything that's like caused a massive scandal or any gossip going on?
Let me see. No, not as yet. I mean, look, clubs are moving behind the scenes, but the transfer window doesn't really warm up until later in the summer. A lot of players are still on pre-season training at the moment. Aston Villa did a good signing yesterday. Yuri Tillemans from Leicester. You're going to see more like that. He was out of contract, and so you're going to see more of that as the summer goes on. Because I tell you what, there's going to be some big money spent to try and catch Manchester City. This team are far out on their own at the moment. I mean, they were 11 points behind in the league a few months ago. The fact that we had a World Cup in the middle of the season, so it was always going to be, because the fixtures were concertina around that and backed up against each other, and it caused a lot of congestion. It was always going to be the team with the biggest squad, the best squad that came out on top. And I think I maintain that City were going to do it, and they did it in the league. They reeled Arsenal in eventually were got several points ahead of them, beat them at home, and of course prevailed in the Champions League.
And just lastly, Aidan, what's going wrong for Manchester United? Because it doesn't seem like there's much to celebrate when it comes to my team.
Look, football is cyclical, and United had it their own way for between '93 and 2013 when Alex Ferguson
Golden days.
They were, yeah, but they're commercially very, very strong. The turning point for them will be the takeover. They will eventually get bought. Probably by the Qatari bid. I would have thought that's been the aim of the Rain Group, who the merchant bank been charged with the task of selling United. They've been trying to reel in a bid from attract a bid from the Qatari not royal family, the investment fund that's there. That will see them compete in a different stratosphere in terms of transfers. Yes, there's financial fair play, which will limit spending initially. There's spending that needs to be done on the stadium, there's spending that needs to be done on the training ground. I think they got complacent towards the end of the Sir Alex Ferguson era because they capitulated as soon as he left. And when I was covering them up there, up in the northwest between 2008 and 2011, it was always said to me, as soon as Sir Alex Ferguson goes, you will see this club will fade away into the darkness just slightly. But it's not irretrievable because it's too big a club, it's too commercially powerful, and that's why it's going to attract a bid of around about £7 billion.
Sir Alex Ferguson, what a legend!
Absolutely, yeah.
I remember. I think my mum got a selfie with him, and she was delighted.
He said to me years ago. He said, I'm going to have to, when I retire, I'm going to have to work even harder than I was when I was Man United manager because I want to keep my brain active. You can't go from 100 miles an hour to stop, just from a mental perspective, psychological perspective, and that's why you see him tour around the world doing
And that's why you're going to be working till you're 95.
Yeah, that's only about 5 years away, though. So.
Absolutely not. Thank you very much indeed,
Cheers,
Aidan
Emily.
McGeether, our sports reporter. Now, moving on to the Duke of Sussex. It's been quite the week for him, hasn't it? First of all, he was late to his own court case due to his daughter's birthday, then a 2-day cross-examination in the witness box made him the first senior royal to testify in court for 130 years. He is, of course, attempting to prove that reporters for the Daily Mirror publishers hacked his phone, amongst other alleged unlawful information gathering. Mirror Group newspapers, of course, denies this. He told the High Court hacking his phone was a risk worth the reward. But will his evidence be enough to convince the jury? It didn't look like it after the 2 days in court. It did seem like he'd gone to the court without any evidence. But joining me now is royal commentator Judita da Silva. Thank you very much indeed for joining me, Judita. Your assessment of this week's trials and tribulations for Harry?
It's kind of a split one for me because on the one hand, in the vein of what you've just said, I think he underestimated just the kind of zeal that he'd be hit with when it came to cross-examination. But then again, based on where he is in his life, he probably would understand that when you're going up against a news organization, they are built for this. They have well-seasoned crisis management teams, very well-seasoned lawyers. And so his cross-examination by Andrew KP kind of did exhibit that his defense and the evidentiary part of bolstering his defense was not as robust as it could have been. But what he did succeed in showing is the kind of almost parasitic level of interest that the news organizations had in him and the royal family. And by exhibiting the different, he said there's over 140 articles being investigated. They're focusing on 33. When you look at the kind of intimate detail that was being covered in these stories, it does prove what he's saying, that as a human being, to have outside forces this interested in personal aspects of your life is not right. And any human being can agree with that.
But that doesn't, but Juditha, sorry to interrupt, but that doesn't really matter, does it? Whether the press were acting in a parasitic fashion, as you said. It's about whether he can prove, on the balance of probabilities, that the paper was engaging in illegal phone hacking or other illegal information gathering.
That's the part where he's not given enough, but there's just enough to keep looking into it, because the evidence that was given by Jane Kerr, who was the former royal editor for the Mirror Group, she said that when she would put together stories on the royals, Piers Morgan, who was then the editor of the Daily Mirror, would inject stuff that she couldn't say where it came from. But when you look at the kind of stuff it was, it could only come with someone who has a deeper link. Did that come from phone hacking? We do not know. Did it come from inside sources? We do not know. But the timeline for some of those articles was during the period after Princess Diana's death, where there was a détente, where everyone said they are off limits because they need time to mourn. How did you get that information then? These are the questions that if you get an answer that the only possibility is phone hacking, you've proven the case. But the Mirror Group has a lot to lose if that happens.
I just worry that, you know, Prince Harry is chasing this sense of justice, vengeance, I don't know, and whether he'll ever whether he'll ever be at peace in a way, whether he'll ever feel emotionally stable when it comes to this sort of thing, because it does seem like his head is very much in the past. And Meghan Markle is looking to the future, judging by her actions, looking to what she's going to be doing in terms of her own PR, potential political aspirations, getting her new blog up and running. Do you think that there's a little bit of a split in terms of where their priorities lie?
I actually think that is probably the most important point, which might create fracture lines. Because the thing is, you're dealing, like I've said before, Prince Harry is a test case for PTSD. This is something that he's been building up to for decades, where he wants a kind of justice, like you said, he might not get and probably will never get. But it's a crusade of righteousness within his mind and his heart. And anyone who if you speak to your humanity and put yourself in his position, you can see his motivation. But practically, it's not tangible. But then he has a family. He has a very young family that has to build towards a future. So either they are collectively saying, you have to do this to put your mind at rest, like you said, while Meghan builds for the future, and eventually they will reconvene and carry on. Or it might create fracture lines where Meghan just wants to move on because she realizes there's no place for me in the UK. I have to build something long-lasting in the US, and there may be tensions, but that's between them.
And just very, very quickly, I don't know if you've seen reports, but apparently Harry and Meghan are not going to be invited to King Charles's birthday celebrations.
Yeah, I think that they should have expected that. He's probably thinking he's never not been invited to the Truth in the Colour, which is celebrating the Sovereign's birthday. He was invited last year, but didn't do the balcony appearance, thinking maybe the same would happen now. But if you're looking at it from the PR teams and be very clinical and very cynical, Harry's radioactive at the moment. And this is something that's public fodder going to be covered by the newspapers who are under attack by Harry. The royals will not want to kind of damage the unspoken understanding they have with the papers that you cover us, we give you access.
Absolutely.
And so Harry has to pull back.
Thank you very much indeed. That's all we've got time for. Juditha De Silva, the royal commentator. Thank you very much for your time. So, the cereal giant, Kellogg's, moving on swiftly, has said that it will no longer require job applicants to have a degree to work at its HQ. This decision comes after they conducted a successful trial of hiring sales staff without degrees. Apprenticeships platform Multiverse found 70% of business leaders say higher education doesn't prepare graduates for work, yet 54% of major companies still require degrees for entry-level roles. So are we wasting time and money on university fees for no good reason? Should most employers take people on straight from school through apprenticeships? Are degrees worth our time? So joining me now to discuss this, there he is, a student of journalism, media and culture at Newcastle University, Adam Wildsmith. Thank you very much indeed. Adam, I look at this, I look at Kellogg's offering entry-level roles to people without degrees. I think that's a good thing, that's progress.
Absolutely. As you say, I'm a journalism student. and I've been in for 2 years. And I honestly think what I've learned in 2 years at university, I probably could have picked up within a couple of months' work experience in a newsroom. I think it's a really positive move by Kellogg's, and my opinion has started to change on this. As you said, it's an entry-level position. It's not like someone's been hired for a senior management position. So I think if someone can go in there at an entry-level position, they can work their way up. That's the way it always was. If you look at the 1960s, for example, someone could train to be an accountant without any A-levels. Now that person would need A-levels and a degree. I think if people can go in an entry-level position, they can work hard, they can show that they can do the job, they should be able to progress.
Yes, and we also have the issue of people coming out of university and then not even being able to get a graduate role. So they end up in a position that they very much could have got without going to university at all.
Yeah, well, we're often told that universities lead to higher paying jobs, and that is sometimes the case, but it's also the case that a lot of times university leads to no job at all. For me, I'm a bit concerned about my prospects when I finish university. There's sort of little talk while you're at university of any experience, internships, or things that will lead to the experience that you'd need to actually progress into the workforce. So I think when students finish further education, there should be a lot more focus on apprenticeships, degree apprenticeships, internships, all the things that are going to actually provide students with the experience to get into the workforce.
Absolutely. The half of the battle is just getting your foot in the door somewhere. I remember when I graduated, the fear, the anxiety, not knowing which direction to go into, not knowing whether you're going to be able to find that job, just to get your foot in the door in whichever industry you thought you might like to do. And people like me just jumped around and found something in the end, and here I am today. So, Adam, how are other students feeling about their degrees? Is there a sense that it's gotten too expensive and it might not always be worth it, or is there still very much the idea that a degree is the way to get a decent job?
I think there's a twofold answer to that question. I think student satisfaction, has been decreasing in recent years, and I think that is owed a lot to strike action in the last few years. Students are paying full fees, and I know in my own experience, I think I've been at university probably about 40 to 50% of the time I really should have been there, and that's owed by and large to strike action. And then I think a lot of students feel they have to go to university because that's really all that's spoken about. I know when I was in school, there was never any mention of work experience, going straight into the workforce, apprenticeships. It was all the university direction. And of course, the government has a target for university attainment. So I think this move by Kellogg's is a positive one. And if other companies can follow suit, hopefully it will be able to sort of reverse that tide that we've been seeing in recent years solely towards university education.
Well, we'll see. Thank you very much indeed for your time, Adam Wildsmith, student of journalism, media and culture at Newcastle University. Wish him all the best for his career search. You're watching and listening to GB News Sunday with me, Emily Carver. Coming up in the next hour, Rishi Sunak allies launch their counter-attack against Boris Johnson amid the escalating Tory tumult. The political landscape has been jolted by the stunning resignation of Boris Johnson following the revelations, of course, of the Partygate inquiry. Two influential allies of his have stepped down too. What does this all mean for the integrity of the Conservative Party and for Rishi Sunak himself? And the Home Office will no longer treat irregular arrivals like channel crossings differently from other asylum seekers. In France this week, 4 young children were stabbed by a Syrian man with refugee status in Sweden. Could this be a massive risk to our national security? I do wonder whether there will be similar attacks in this country, and what can we do to make sure we vet people who are coming across the channel? That seems common sense to me. I'm sure it is to you. And clinicians and psychologists have welcomed NHS England's decision to ban puberty blockers for children suffering from gender dysphoria outside of clinical research. All of that more coming up in the next hour. Don't go anywhere.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing with the audience very much at the heart of it. like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat.
Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News. The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Welcome to GB News Sunday. I'm Emily Carver. For the next hour, I'll be keeping you company on TV, online and radio. So coming up this hour, Rishi Sunak allies are fighting back against Boris Johnson amid a growing Tory row. The former Prime Minister dramatically resigned as MP on Friday over the outcome of the Partygate inquiry. Two of his allies have also quit with immediate effect. Rishi Sunak now has 3 by-elections on his hands. What does this mean for the Tory party? What does this mean for Rishi Sunak? And what should Boris Johnson do next? And the Home Office will no longer treat irregular arrivals like channel crossings differently from other asylum seekers. We'll also be looking back to that attack in France this week. 4 young children were stabbed by a Syrian man with refugee status in Sweden. Should we be looking again at the way we vet those coming across the channel? Is there a risk to our national security? And clinicians and psychologists have welcomed NHS England's decision to ban puberty blockers for children suffering from gender dysphoria outside of clinical research. Is that a good idea? It seems to me this is common sense. But first, let's get the news headlines with Rory Smith.
Thank you very much, Emily. 3 British tourists are missing after a dive boat burst into flames in the Red Sea off Egypt. Officials say 12 Britons were rescued, along with 12 Egyptian crew and guides. The Foreign Office has confirmed it's in contact with Egyptian authorities and assisting those involved. One of Boris Johnson's allies says the resignations of 2 Tory MPs was not a coordinated attempt to undermine the Prime Minister. Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg says there is no plot against Rishi Sunak and he believes he should remain leader. He also suggested Mr Johnson could return to Westminster, saying he could easily get back into Parliament at the next election. The former PM announced he was stepping down as an MP after he was handed the findings of the Partygate inquiry. Well, Sir Jacob says there could be a split if some MPs try to block his return, but he admits some things could have been done better.
one always deserves blame for one's own mistakes. It would be absurd of me to pretend that Boris hasn't made mistakes. There was a man called Peter Wentworth who in the late 16th century was locked up in the Tower for saying in the House of Commons, "None is without fault, no, not our gracious Queen." The same could be said of Boris. None is without fault, no, not our gracious Boris. That is true of all of us.
Well, meanwhile, Leave campaigner Nigel Farage believes it's the end for Boris Johnson with the Conservatives. But the GB News presenter told Camilla Tominey he's been talking to Tory MPs about potentially joining a new party.
The good side of Boris, of course, is, just look at today's newspapers.
Yeah.
He's very good at dominating news.
Yeah.
He does have personality. He does make people smile. And if he wants to defend his Brexit legacy, well, I want to defend my Brexit legacy too. So would there be a possibility of a new coming together on the centre-right? It'd be Boris Johnson. There'd be other MPs that would join in with this as well.
Have you discussed this with Boris Johnson?
Not with him directly, no. But I have discussed it with people very close to him.
In other news this afternoon, yellow thunderstorm warnings have been issued as temperatures continue to climb across the country. The Met Office says the alerts affect parts of Scotland, Northern Ireland, England and Wales. That'll be in force until 9 o'clock tomorrow night, while temperatures are expected to hit 32 degrees today. Ukraine says its counter-offensive against Russia is underway. President Zelensky says he's optimistic about regaining lost territory. It's after Ukraine said its forces had advanced up to 2,000 metres along the front line. That's near the eastern city of Bakhmut, while Russia is disputing those claims. Homeowners are being hit with what Labour is describing as a Tory mortgage penalty of £7,000 a year. The party says interest rates are triple what they were 2 years ago, and the average homeowner is paying an extra £150 a week as a result of the mini-budget. Well, the government says it's working on halving inflation to help struggling households. The government has announced £58 million of funding to help people with health conditions get back to work. 25,000 people in England will benefit from that scheme and will be referred to the service by GPs. Well, the funding will help them start or stay in jobs by March 2025. DVLA workers have started their 2-week strike action in the long-running civil service dispute. Members of the PCS union are taking action at Typhelan and Swansea. That's likely to lead to backlogs for driving licences. Well, the union has been given an improved offer to end the dispute, including the promise of a £1,500 payment to each member. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now, though, back to Emily.
Thanks, Rory. So, Rishi Sunak now faces 3 by-elections after Boris Johnson and his allies Nadine Dorries and Nigel Adams resigned with immediate effect. Boris Johnson, he believes he has been the victim of an establishment stitch-up, but has his support within the party and the country run out? And what does this all mean for Rishi Sunak? Will he be able to put the Boris drama behind him, unite the fragmented party? And what's Boris Johnson going to do next? What will he do now? Is a comeback on the cards? Is it time he hung up his political gloves for good? He's unlikely to disappear, but let's see what Tom Harwood, our deputy political reporter, has for us. Tom, are you on resignation watch? There's talk of potentially more resignations, allies of Boris.
There's certainly talk of it. Indeed, I've spoken to a number of Conservative MPs who would be seen to be close to Boris Johnson, however, and some of them are not keen on the idea. That being said, of course, both Nigel Adams and Nadine Dorries were said to not be wanting to cause by-elections until the 11th hour, when they did indeed call by-elections in their seats through their resignations. These 3 different by-elections should, in normal times, not be particularly challenging to a government, to a majority government. Of course, there's a 7,000 vote majority in Boris Johnson's seat of Uxbridge and South Ruislip. That might be a tricky sort of defence in normal times. But the other 2, Nadine Dorries' seat and indeed Nigel Adams' seats have a 20,000 and a 25,000 majority, respectively. These should not be seats that fall to opposition parties. However, in recent years, we have seen that sort of scale of upset, particularly in Tiverton and Honiton last year, where the Liberal Democrats overturned a 24,000 vote majority. So this stuff is now not off the cards, and it is looking like it'll be a challenging set of by-elections for the Prime Minister. The question is whether or not these by-elections were called to cause maximum harm to the Prime Minister, to a Prime Minister who many around Boris Johnson see as being responsible for the downfall of the former Prime Minister. Well, while many people are suggesting that this is a coordinated attempt to wound Rishi Sunak, that's not what every ally of Boris Johnson is saying. Indeed, earlier today on GB News, Jacob Rees-Mogg said that he didn't think this was a coordinated attempt or a coordinated attack.
I'm afraid I think this plot for lots of people to resign is invented. I think two people decided they wanted to leave Parliament, both of whom had indicated that desire already. They've just slightly changed the timetable, both of whom were expecting to retire to peerages rather than to the Chiltern Hundreds. I'm unaware of any plot of this kind. It's speculation not based on sufficient evidence.
Now, of course, Jacob Rees-Mogg is right that it is speculation. However, it is also true that those resignations that had already been expected, the resignations at the time of the general election, were expected to be just that. Both Nadine Dorries and Nigel Adams had said they'd be standing down at the 2024 general election. So this is a change from their original position. This calling of these two by-elections in the case of these two MPs is a rather radical bringing forward of their retirement date than had been expected.
What does this tell us about Sunak, the Prime Minister's authority over the Conservative Party? Did he have an opportunity to stop this from unfolding as it has?
Well, it's curious. It can be viewed in two ways. On the one hand, it shows that Rishi Sunak does not have an iron grip over his party, that there are rebellious individuals within it who, at least incidentally, are going to cause him harm. Whether they want to or not, of course, is a matter for debate. On the other hand, it has been noted by several commentators that if Rishi Sunak is very unlucky in these three general elections, those three seats might be represented by MPs who wish to do him great political harm. Well, some might suggest that they were already represented by MPs who did not want to see Rishi Sunak succeed. So perhaps losing these three seats in the by-elections to come might not be changing the arithmetic in the House of Commons as much as the party labels might have suggested. That, however, is speculation. But of course, it would be wounding for Rishi Sunak to lose three notionally safe Conservative seats. It would point to a Prime Minister who was not on course for a general election victory.
And of course, Tom, just lastly, you say that, and opposition parties, of course, unsurprisingly, are now calling for a general election. There are quite a lot of people around the country who are fed up of this infighting.
Yes, you're right, and indeed it is sort of the raison d'etre of opposition parties to call for general elections. It's sort of what they do. It's what David Cameron did in 2007, indeed in 2009, and in 2010. It's what Jeremy Corbyn did in 2017, 18, 19, until that general election arrived. I think it would be really rather odd if the leader of the opposition was saying, no, we shouldn't have an election. So perhaps that is to be expected. However, it is true to say that the Labour Party is riding high in the polls right now, and there hasn't been a great deal of evidence to show a grand turnaround in the fortunes of the Conservative Party. Indeed, it's something that Boris Johnson wrote himself in his resignation statement. Perhaps resignation essay would be a better word to describe it. He said when he resigned as Prime Minister, the Conservative Party was 4 or 5 points behind in the polls, and as things stand, that gulf, that gap, is considerably wider.
Well, viewers don't need to worry. We will be scrutinising Labour and their various pledges that don't seem to they don't seem to have stuck by. So we'll be scrutinising those coming up later in the show. But thank you very much for taking us through all the Boris Johnson drama. Deputy political reporter Tom Harwood there in sunny South London. Thank you very much indeed. So joining me now is former member of the European Parliament David Campbell-Bannerman and pollster and Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde, Sir John Curtis. Thank you very much indeed for joining me. So I guess, John, where do we stand when it comes to the polling on all of this? I imagine that the public is very much divided on whether they think Boris is a victim or whether he is the architect of his own demise.
Well, the pollsters haven't addressed that question directly, but they have asked two crucial questions. Question number one, did Boris Johnson mislead the House of Commons? The latest polling from YouGov done yesterday suggests that nearly 2/3 of people think that he did and less than 1 in 5 think that he didn't. And nearly a half of those people who voted Conservative in 2019 think he misled the House of Commons. Equally, they have asked whether or not he was right or wrong to resign. Again, nearly 2/3 of people think he was right to resign. And again, the figure amongst Conservative voters is nearly 50%. The honest truth is that, at least so far as whether or not people feel that Boris Johnson is telling the truth or not about Partygate, the public have been pretty sceptical ever since that whole row first emerged in December 2021 with that now famous clip of Allegra Stratton addressing a mock press conference. And now, many months on, the public are now pretty clearly of the view that Mr. Johnson was indeed misleading in his statements to the House of Commons. So, yes, there still is an element of those who voted Conservative who do trust the Prime Minister, but they are now very much decidedly a minority, certainly within the public as a whole, and probably within the broader body of Conservative voters.
Interesting. David, I'll put that question to you directly. Do you believe Boris Johnson is a victim or he's been the architect of his own demise?
I think he's a victim. I think this has been a witch hunt. I mean, polling actually reflects, I'm sure Sir John, who I've got huge regard for, by the way, that would reinforce this, that, polling reflects media. And if you've had 3 or 4 months of being attacked, as Boris was, over the cake, which in the Privilege Committee we found out he never actually ate or saw, then, they are going to be swayed by that. And I think we've had a kangaroo court. It is a kangaroo court. I mean, what court of law would allow a judge to tweet 3 times saying the defendant is guilty before they actually hear the evidence? I mean, that's what happened in this committee. So I understand the effect on the polling, but Boris is a remarkable politician, and I believe he will bounce back from this. And he has had a form in actually winning an election against the odds with a massive majority, the biggest since 1987.
David, just on that, people who are speaking out in support of Boris does seem to be, well, the number does seem to be shrinking. It does seem as though people were saying that there may be 6, 7 resignations immediately after Boris Johnson's. That doesn't seem to have come to fruition. We've only had Nadine Dorries and Nigel Adams. Do you think Boris Johnson has the support of the public to be able to come back, to be able to garner the support he once had?
I do, actually, and I think there will be further resignations, maybe not at the moment, but I think in the pipeline. And, I mean, what people discussed about is getting rid of such a popular prime minister, such a successful prime minister with no mandate. We've got a prime minister who was rejected 2 months before being forced by MPs on the nation now. It's undemocratic, and it's a lack of democracy which is worrying people. And Boris referred to the lack of democracy in this Privileges Committee. So I think he's been very hard done by, and I think he will come back stronger, and actually he's free and he's dangerous now, Boris. And I think he will be, he'll say some very interesting things. And I think Sunak is on borrowed time as a result of this.
That may well be true. Sir John, polling expert, do you think there is a gap in the market for a new centre-right party?
Well, the fact that you asked that question does tell you something about the state of the Conservative Party at the moment. Mr. Johnson has certainly added fuel to the concerns that are already there. One, can Mr. Sunak possibly win a general election? Two, is Mr. Sunak determined to reduce the size of the state? Although, of course, the growth in the size of the state, the growth in taxation, the growth in public spending actually occurred under Mr. Johnson's watch. And thirdly, the concern that Mr. Sunak is too willing to compromise with the European Union over the future of Brexit, and that although he voted leave, he's not necessarily a true believer. Those arguments are certainly going on. But I think what one also has to realise is that if Mr. Sunak is going to have a chance of winning the next general election, then actually what he is going to have to do is he is going to have to try to draw a line in voters' minds between one, Boris Johnson's administration, and two, Liz Truss. Because at the end of the day, in the wake of Partygate, Boris Johnson's popularity, which is, by the way, was always confined to those who voted leave. Boris Johnson was never a very popular prime minister. He was very popular amongst those who voted leave. His success rested on his ability on persuading them to vote Conservative in 2019. But even amongst that group, his popularity fell away in the wake of Partygate. And of course, the Liz Truss fiscal event is something that plunged the Conservatives into very deep electoral difficulty. Mr. Sunak has to persuade people he is a new administration. And I think Boris Johnson being outside the House of Commons, although it's going to cause difficulty in the short run, particularly with respect to by-elections, which won't necessarily be easy to defend, in the longer run, perhaps it gives Mr. Sunak a greater opportunity to distance himself from his two predecessors.
And David, just finally, on that Brexit question, what does this mean for Brexiteers? Is there a fear now that with Boris gone out of the political game, Brexit could sort of fade away, ambitions for making the most of it, whatever that looks like, may fade away too?
Well, I'm very disappointed with what the government's been doing. I mean, the retained EU law bill, which gets rid of a lot of excessive EU laws, that's been watered down almost to the point of not happening at all. The Windsor Agreement with Northern Ireland, it gives the EU a lot of power. I'm afraid this isn't a proper Brexit government, and it's showing. And a lot of those Brexit supporters have left and are not going to come back unless you get Boris back, actually, and they'll trust Boris. And it's very interesting what Sir John says, that, he was never particularly popular. And I think what Partygate's done is actually just those that always hated him have hated him even more. But, let's not wipe out the fact that he is still very popular amongst some large numbers of the public and certainly the party.
Yeah. He is. And there is a little bit of Brexit derangement syndrome sometimes that goes into Boris derangement syndrome. I think that is fair to say. Thank you very much indeed for both of your time. Former member of the European Parliament, David Campbell-Bannerman, and pollster and Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde, Sir John Curtis. Thank you very much for your time this Sunday afternoon. Now, lots of you have been getting in touch. Maggie has to say, Boris has had enough of Conservative, Remainers and globalists. MPs have finally got rid of him. There you go, Margaret says. At the moment, Boris is earning millions on the speaking circuit, so I don't think he's really bothered about being an MP. Oh, I don't know about that. He does have a massive ego, and being a politician does bring you power, which I think he likes. Gary says, Johnson has no class and is acting like a spoilt child. He obviously doesn't care about the Tory party. He just wants attention. Everyone I know rolls their eyes when he's mentioned. Well, yes, perhaps if he did care about the Conservative Party and cared about a Conservative government, he would put his support behind Rishi Sunak, which he certainly is not doing. Barry says, for goodness sake, Boris was the best thing to hit politics for years. I know lots of people and almost all think Britain is much worse off without him. Well, there you go. I think our inbox very much reflects how divisive this issue is, how divisive Boris Johnson is. Very much Marmite character there. Keep your views coming in. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter. We're at GB News. You are watching and listening to GB News Sunday with me, Emily Carver. We've got lots more coming up on today's show, including the Home Office will no longer treat irregular arrivals, like channel crossings, differently from other asylum seekers. How do you feel about this? Could this be a risk to our safety? Don't go anywhere.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me. So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Deebs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News. Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to GB News Sunday with me, Emily Carver, on your TV, online and digital radio. Now, earlier this week, there was a horrific knife attack in Annecy in France, and it got me thinking about whether we vet people who are crossing the channel to this country adequately or not. There is talk of amnesty, giving amnesty to thousands of people who have come across that way, asylum seekers. And I do worry whether the Home Office, in a bid to be speedy and quick with processing and get through that backlog, might miss people who could be a potential threat. So is our safety being put at risk by our asylum system? Joining me now is former Detective Sergeant at Merseyside Police and lecturer at Leeds Beckett University, David Lowe. David, when you saw what happened in Annecy, were you reminded of what we saw in Reading, in a park in Reading, for example, when a failed asylum seeker also went on a rampage? And I worry that, and this is not to colour all asylum seekers in a negative light, but I do worry that our Home Office and our border security aren't vetting people closely enough.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, also to make the point that we're not talking about all asylum seekers who are coming here. But you're quite right. I did remember the incident at Reading. I also remember the incident in my home city where I come from, in Liverpool, with an asylum seeker. It was dealt with as a terrorist incident where he had an improvised explosive device in a taxi that detonated outside a women's hospital. So we have had some incidents related to asylum seeking. And, what is quite the point, you look at France, They haven't treated it as a terrorist incident. But you're looking at someone who has issues with his asylum seeking in Sweden, then travels to France and carries out that horrendous attack. And you look at who he targets, I think made it even more disgusting, really, than what we would normally expect. But, you know, we have to be careful with who's coming into this country. We have to make sure that, as you said, the vetting's done properly, Emily.
And how can the government go about this? Because, as we know, there are tens of thousands of people crossing in a dinghy to the Dover coast. How can the Home Office get this right when it comes to vetting? Because the process must be so difficult. People don't have their documentation. People are coming from war zones. People are coming from across the entire globe. How does it actually work in practice? How do we make sure that someone crossing the channel isn't going to be a risk to our national security?
Oh, well, that is a very important question, an important issue to resolve, because, as you said, you've got varying causes of why people want to come to this country. As you said, we have our political asylum seekers, those whose lives and their families whose lives are at threat. We have economic migrants. We have that sort of wide area of people coming in. I don't think we've got proper facilities, certainly at the South Coast, to deal with this effectively. That is one problem we've got. We've got a Home Office who's been more hell-bent on what to do with people when they come in and send them back. I mean, you look at the money they spent on this Rwanda program, money that could have been better spent having proper detention areas. And when I say detention area, don't treat it like a prison or a cell. You have it where they can be dealt with properly. Are they properly equipped? They're being fed correctly. They're being housed correctly. And let the process and take the time to go through this, because this is the problem we've got, Emily. We've got individuals who are coming through. Obviously, those who come in illegally and don't go through this process, that's another issue. But looking at those who do, I don't think they're going through the process diligently and with enough that is protecting us with these odd ones that will come through and pose a danger to us.
Yeah, and it's very interesting. I don't know if you've seen, but of course Europe are having many of the same conversations we are in this country, not least because of that attack in Annecy. But it was reported that Germany wants to adopt a Rwanda-style scheme for the European Union, something like this. It seems that every country in Europe is trying to tackle this problem, finding it extremely hard. You don't seem to think that Rwanda-style schemes are the way forward.
Well, you've got to be very careful. What's the main priority? Where you're going to spend your money on? And you know, you raised Germany. I mean, it's a really good example. In some ways, they're paying the price for the Angela Merkel's decision to open the doors widely. And you've got other consequences that have happened, where you've got asylum seekers being put up in areas in small towns and villages, and you've got the local people who are now questioning, well, if they're getting all these benefits, they're getting all this treatment, what about the indigenous people? And they're seeing a rise in extremism, certainly far-right extremism, which is, you know, an issue that, you know, does have consequences with it. I mean, we've seen it here and in the Republic of Ireland with protests outside asylum seekers now, you know, and we saw a very violent one in the Knowsley area a few months ago. So on top of having this process and where you're putting these people, that is an issue, because then that sort of causes problems within the community, as well as individuals who are coming in who've got to be properly vetted, and that's have a proper detention centre, have a proper system at the point of entry, rather than looking at the exit. Let's get the entry right, and then we'll deal with the exit, if that makes sense.
Yes, that does make sense. Thank you very much indeed. Former Detective Sergeant at Merseyside Police and lecturer at Leeds Beckett University, David Lowe. Thank you very much indeed for your time. I think it is fair for people to question why our asylum system is not vetting people adequately. We cannot live in a country where national security is not the top priority of our government. It should be. Anyway, it has been very warm in many towns and cities yesterday. It is boiling hot in the studio, let me tell you. But more places are likely to see thunderstorms today. The Met Office has issued another yellow weather warning for thunderstorms covering a large part of the country from midday till 9 p.m. Joining us now is our East Midlands reporter, Will Hollis. Will, are the storms brewing?
Good afternoon. Yeah, well, it's quite overcast actually right now here in Nottingham. Occasionally the bright sun comes out and it's quite warm where I'm standing alongside the River Trent. Behind me you might see people sunbathing or at least trying to hide from the sun in the shade. There are two things that you're really being warned about right now when it comes to the weather. Number one is the amber weather warning for large parts of the country, for the East and West Midlands, as well as southern England and east of England. So the amber weather warning is basically the second of three tiers, and that basically means it's not just vulnerable people that are at risk from the heat health alert that's been put out by the UK HSA, that's the Health and Security Agency. It's not just people that might have problems with cardiovascular diseases. A lot of people within society could be at risk if they spend too long out in the sun today and they don't drink lots of water. So that is number one. The second thing, as you said there a few moments ago, is these yellow weather warnings for thunderstorms and for rains. These are put out by the Met Office, and what they're warning about is that there could be thunderstorms throughout the country. Now, the yellow weather warning is the lowest tier, so that means that there's the possibility. So lots of people at home might be saying, we haven't seen any thunderstorms. It's basically just that there is a warning that there is a possibility. What that means, if there's that possibility, is you might have a sudden thunderstorm, get some localised flooding, and that could cause disruption for travel. The latest news on this now, though, is that the Met Office has just brought in a brand new yellow weather warning for tomorrow for thunderstorms. So if you don't see them today, you might see thunderstorms in England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland tomorrow.
Well, there you go. I do love how excited we get as Brits about the weather. Oh, a storm's coming. Oh, it's a bit hot today. And the NHS and the government all put out their statements. Thank you very much indeed, Will. Overcast in Nottingham, but roaring hot here in London. You're watching and listening to GB News Sunday with me, Emily Carver. We've got lots more coming up on today's show. Keir Starmer told you we'd be scrutinising the Labour Party a little bit. He's making a U-turn on plans to spend $28 billion a year on new green jobs and technology. Has he given up on net zero? Is this a huge setback for the Labour Party? Find out more after the news with Rory Smith.
Thank you very much, Emily. 3 British tourists are missing after a dive boat burst into flames in the Red Sea off Egypt. Officials said 12 Britons were rescued, along with 12 Egyptian crew and guides. The Foreign Office has confirmed it's in contact with Egyptian authorities and assisting those involved. One of Boris Johnson's allies says the resignations of 2 Tory MPs was not a coordinated attempt to undermine the Prime Minister. Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg says there is no plot against Rishi Sunak and he believes he should remain leader. He also suggested Mr Johnson could return to Westminster, saying he could easily get back into Parliament at the next election.
One always deserves blame for one's own mistakes. It would be absurd of me to pretend that Boris hasn't made mistakes. There was a man called Peter Wentworth who in the late 16th century was locked up in the Tower for saying in the House of Commons, "None is without fault, no, not our gracious Queen." The same could be said of Boris. None is without fault, no, not our gracious Boris. That is true of all of us.
Yellow thunderstorm warnings have been issued as temperatures continue to climb across the country. The Met Office says the alerts affect parts of Scotland, Northern Ireland, England and Wales and will be in force until 9 o'clock tomorrow night. Temperatures are expected to hit 32 degrees today. That's you up to date, but you can get more on all of those stories by visiting our website. That is gbnews.com.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
Is the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.
Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Right, on GB News.
Welcome back. You're watching and listening to GB News Sunday with me, Emily Carver, on your TV and radio. We've got some breaking news to bring you. In the last few moments, Nicola Sturgeon has been arrested in the investigation into the SNP's finances, Police Scotland have said. Let's go live now to our political editor. Oh, he's not with us yet. We'll have him in just one moment. We'll be getting the very latest indeed. We'll be coming to that. That is big news. Nicola Sturgeon, the former SNP leader, has been arrested over the investigation into party finances. We'll be getting the very latest political response to that analysis as well from our very own Deputy Political Editor Tom Harwood in just one moment. But first, we're going to scrutinise the Labour Party a little. Sir Keir Starmer and the party have taken another U-turn, backtracking on its economic plan to spend £28 billion a year on new green jobs and technology. Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, insisted that Labour would look to ramp up green investment, but blamed the Tories for the sharp U-turn. She says she didn't foresee what the Conservatives would do to our economy. Is this another step back for Starmer and the Labour Party? I'm joined by Benny Pizer, who's the director of Net Zero Watch. Benny, thank you very much indeed. Now, to me, it seems that this backtrack from Rachel Reeves, the fact they're not going to be spending £28 billion a year on green investment anytime soon, seems to signal perhaps an acknowledgement that net zero policies are a bit pricey.
Yeah, indeed. And it's a very shrewd move. It shows that Labour is concerned about the economy, and they're realizing that Ed Miliband's utopian spending plans are just not affordable. And therefore, this U-turn makes them look just a little bit more credible now, because the plans were just, suicidal for the economy.
Yes, so in terms of Labour Party, how is it trying to... It needs to reach out to both the London metropolitan and city dwellers who are very pro-net zero, but also working-class voters who may well work in these industries. How can it square that circle?
This is very difficult, and my guess is they won't do that until they are in power. Countries around Europe are beginning to water down and abandon these policies because there's such a public upheaval around Europe about the cost of energy. I expect the cost of energy and the cost of net zero to be one of the key election issues. And I wouldn't be surprised if that isn't the last U-turn.
And what do you think this says in terms of the Conservative Party too? Because the Conservative Party is very much pushing net zero policy as well. Yes, they haven't signed up to £28 billion a year of green investment, but they're not far behind, are they?
No. This is why the Conservatives are in such a mess. They've messed up the economy. They've messed up our energy infrastructure. The energy is one of the highest in the world. So they have really very little to show, and they just hope that Labour will keep this promise to ban oil and gas development in the North Sea, because they hope that they can turn this.
Very sorry to interrupt you there, but I'm sure you've seen that we've had the breaking news that Nicola Sturgeon has in fact been arrested. But thank you very much indeed for your time, Benny Pizer there of Net Zero Watch. Yes, that's the breaking news to bring you. In the last few moments, Nicola Sturgeon has been arrested in the investigation into the SNP's finances. Police Scotland have said. I have Nigel Nelson here with me in the studio. Nigel, this is an absolutely momentous thing to happen.
Isn't it? I mean, it's not really unexpected. We've been thinking for some time that the police would probably feel Nicola Sturgeon's collar. So far, she becomes the third arrest now, and what they're investigating is £600,000 of donations and quite who was doing what with them. Now, there's been no charges yet for anybody. It was very likely that Nicola Sturgeon, as First Minister and leader of the SNP at the time, would eventually have to be questioned by police.
Well, yes, and who else so far has been questioned by police? Remind us.
Well, her husband has, and there's one other who I now forget, but certainly her husband has been questioned because he was looking after those funds. And I would imagine that there would be more, that the whole question of SNP finances are now coming under the microscope, and there are likely to be others who will be looked at.
And it's interesting because all eyes have been on Westminster and the political saga that's going on within the Conservative Party. Look to Scotland, SNP former leader arrested.
Yeah, I mean, that's why it's been an extraordinary weekend, really.
Absolutely extraordinary. And what does this mean for the SNP? Will this dominate the headlines? It seems to me that the SNP seem to sometimes get away with this sort of thing. It comes in and out of the papers, it comes in and out of the limelight. But this is absolutely huge. Nicola Sturgeon arrested, potentially over the finances of the party.
And I think that the SNP are obviously in real trouble over this. I mean, it wasn't a very good look when they couldn't even find any accountants to actually sign off on their accounts. So, in electoral terms, the opinion polls have been sort of dipping for them. Labour will want to use this as the best opportunity they can to capture some seats up in Scotland. What Keir Starmer really needs is, if he can get 20 seats up in Scotland, he doesn't have to worry about a hung parliament down here.
And what does this mean for Humza Yousaf, who's only just taken over as leader of the party?
Yeah, it was the worst time possible he could do that. He's trying to distance himself from the whole thing, and fair enough, he's not been implicated in any of this. So as far as his position goes, he probably is okay, but it's not the greatest start to a leadership.
No, and of course there was so much talk and speculation over why Nicola Sturgeon stepped down as leader. Was it over the gender recognition laws that were deeply controversial, or was it this.
I have to say that when I heard her speak, when she actually did step down, I found that quite genuine, that basically she'd had enough, that she spent...
Really, Nigel?
Well, most of her life in politics, and there comes a point where you say, look, enough is enough. She wanted some me time, basically. So that sounded good, but obviously the suspicion is that this was swirling around behind the scenes, and that's why, one of the reasons why she knew it was time to go.
And this is not the first scandal to engulf the SNP, is it?
No, I mean, the SNP have had constant problems. I think this is probably the worst, though, that they've ever had, something like this, because when there are questions about how donors' money is being used, and ordinary people's money, bear in mind these are ordinary supporters, how that is being used, that's always a very bad look.
Thank you very much, Nigel. Will you stay with me here? We are going to go to Tom Harwood, our Deputy Political Editor. Tom, are you there? Thank you very much indeed. Got you back in front of the camera for more breaking news. Nicola Sturgeon arrested over investigation into parties' finances.
What a weekend it has turned out to be. No rest for the wicked. Friday afternoon is, of course, supposed to be a relatively quiet time, and yet we saw the resignation of Boris Johnson. Sunday, of course, the news is supposed to happen in the morning with the big political shows. Well, it's this afternoon. What a bombshell from the SNP. Of course, many people had been predicting that something like this could happen, although, of course, the two previous arrests in this SNP finance probe had happened several months ago. Let's not forget that there were 3 names on the financial documents of the SNP, the questionable financial documents of the SNP. The person in charge of the party, who indeed was Nicola Sturgeon's husband, who was the first arrest. Secondly, the party treasurer was the second arrest. But the third name on those documents was the party leader, Nicola Sturgeon. And many people were speculating that Police Scotland would indeed be therefore arresting and questioning Nicola Sturgeon, and indeed that is what has happened. Nicola Sturgeon has been arrested this afternoon. She sits currently in police custody, facing questions from Police Scotland. A remarkable turn of events from someone who held almost absolute power in Scotland only a few months ago, now sitting in prison, arrested in custody of the police.
And the impact on her reputationally will be absolutely massive, I imagine. Many people, when they talked about Nicola Sturgeon, would say she is a fantastic politician, a brilliant orator, and now she's sitting in custody.
It is the most remarkable fall from grace. Of course, no doubt she will be released after this questioning has completed, but it does suggest that there was a fairly large amount of evidence that got Police Scotland to this point. Otherwise, why would they have brought in the former First Minister of Scotland for questioning? It does point to a lot of very, very deep searching questions about how the SNP has run its finances. And of course, the political implications cannot be overstated. There is, of course, a by-election coming up in Scotland in the not too distant future. That is, if indeed the recall petition currently being organised in the seat of Margaret Ferrier is successful, which all suggestions are that it will be. 10% of the constituents or the voting constituents within her seat in mid-Scotland, in that central belt, need to sign that petition in order for a recall election to happen. And indeed, it is highly likely that that will pass in the not-too-distant future. And therefore, we will see the electoral effect of this turmoil within the SNP. Of course, their poll ratings had been in decline for several months now. But it does seem that the great beneficiaries of this SNP polling collapse may well be the Labour Party.
Well, yes, it's interesting that you raise that point, because looking ahead to a general election that will come in not too long now, actually, Humza Yousaf will be facing a huge challenge to get back support for the SNP. This will be huge reputational damage.
It certainly will be. It's not impossible that the SNP will be not even the largest party in Scottish politics after the next election. It's looking likely now that they will not have an absolute majority of seats north of the border. We have probably seen the high watermark of the SNP come and go, and the implications for that are enormous. Might they, after a less than impressive general election showing, might they in the next Scottish parliamentary elections lose their mandate to govern? They of course are already only governing in Holyrood as part of a deal with the Green Party there. They don't have a majority of seats in the Scottish Parliament. They only won a majority back in 2011 for that term. So there are big questions over the political fortunes of the SNP and the fallout from the internal finance mess and the big questions of competency and propriety that have been raised. And let's not forget, Humza Yousaf was the sort of continuity candidate in the Scottish National Party internal election, in their leadership election. He was seen to be the person who was closer to Nicola Sturgeon, closer to that regime that has now been that has had quite a lot of mud thrown at it, quite frankly. And so there are questions in terms of whether the SNP made the right choice in that leadership election. Perhaps a cleaner break with the past would have been better for them in a political sense. What is clear is that there are big questions over how the SNP has handled itself, and no doubt political knock-on effects from that.
Thank you very much indeed, Tom Harwood, our Deputy Political Editor there, bringing us the very latest on what is an extraordinary story, and a story that's rather taken the heat off Rishi Sunak, perhaps. Nicola Sturgeon arrested. That's over the investigation into the party's finances. So she's sitting in custody, questions to be answered. Absolutely massive news. I've still got Nigel Nelson here with me in the studio. Taken the heat off Rishi Sunak somewhat. Blimey.
Yeah, I bet he's relieved at the moment. He's probably out enjoying the sun now. He feels he can
Quite possibly.
Yes, he can relax a bit. But obviously, this is quite serious. And the real question is what happens next. Bear in mind, the previous two people were released without charge.
Yes.
But I mean, there's some weird things have been going on that Peter Murrell's and Nicola Sturgeon's husband's mother had a caravan seized because police were investigating it. There's a lot going on behind the scenes that we don't know about yet, but it's now beginning to come to fruition.
Well, very much so. And seeing Nicola Sturgeon arrested, what kind of questions will be asked about the finances exactly? Can you remind us of exactly what was the concern, what is being investigated, which money, where, when, what?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was £600,000, and these were donations that were given during the EU referendum campaign. And what the party promised was that they would spend that money on the independence referendum campaign. What seems to have happened is that a lot of that money cannot be accounted for at the moment, and that's the crux of the police investigation, to try and find out where that money went.
Well, Nicola Sturgeon, the SNP, she was the face of Scotland for many people. She was the figurehead, the mother hen of Scotland for people who were SNP inclined that way. Massive demise to see her now arrested, in custody, public finances and parties' finances under such scrutiny. As we were talking there with Tom, Humza Yousaf has a massive challenge on his hands to, well, reputationally, to lift the SNP out of this mess.
Yes, I mean, in a sense, Nicola Sturgeon was the SNP.
She was, yes.
She was a really charismatic politician, in a sense, like Boris Johnson, really, and certainly became the absolute essence of the SNP. And I think Tom was right, that when he was talking about Humza Yousaf being the continuity candidate, he was very much her choice. He was very much that he was going to continue what Nicola Sturgeon started. So obviously there will be question marks over Humza Yousaf's leadership, depending where this investigation goes.
Well, what does Humza Yousaf do in this situation? As the head of the SNP, does he now have to release a statement? Does he need to do a press conference? Because this is big stuff.
Yeah,
he needs to be seen as taking this extremely seriously?
I think if I was in his position, I would do what, say, Rishi Sunak is doing and go out and enjoy the sun and stay quiet, actually.
I don't think there's any chance of having some enjoyment with this in the news.
No, but I mean, the thing is that there's very little he can say, that we're still at the stages of a police investigation. No charges have been made, let alone any kind of court case, even if one should happen. So at the moment, there's very little that Humza Yousaf can actually say or do.
And this is a party that exists to, well, break the United Kingdom, to separate Scotland from the United Kingdom, and now embroiled in all of this, allegations, investigations into the party's finances. So it lost sight of its aim, perhaps. We've seen the SNP adopt many progressive policies. They've seen a huge division when it came to choosing their now leader, Humza Yousaf. The party itself is sort of falling apart without even this.
Well, I mean, certainly it's taken a lot of the efforts away from the independence movement. I mean, I think as long as the SNP can hold itself together, it will always be a party of independence. And the whole point there was that because in Scotland they voted to remain in the EU, there is a very good reason why they should now have another independence referendum, because everything's changed since 2014.
Well, I don't know about that. But I will remind viewers that we have breaking news today. Nicola Sturgeon has been arrested. This is in the investigation into the SNP's finances. Police Scotland have said this. They have released this statement. This is momentous. We've seen previously her husband taken in for questioning. We've seen various people be accused of making, well, essentially, the party's finances are under massive scrutiny, and it is now a police investigation, and Nicola Sturgeon has herself been arrested as the leader of the SNP. What other consequences to this might there be?
Well, I think we've got to see where the investigation goes. I mean, certainly she will be questioned. It may well be she'll be released without charge. Her husband was questioned for 12 hours when he was arrested. But so far, the important thing is no charges have actually been made. So at the moment, I think we have to let the investigation run its course and see if they are.
Well, presumably she could be out very soon. It could be very, very quick indeed.
Yeah, I mean,
answer a few questions and off you go.
Yeah, I wouldn't expect it to stay that long, but I mean, I would think it's pretty intense questioning. I mean, there's a lot the police need to know, and now they've finally gone to the former leader of the SNP, the former First Minister. It shows just how seriously the police are taking it.
Well, it does very much indeed, and any accusation of corruption in politics should be taken seriously, particularly when it involves such a massive amount of money, £600,000. Where did it go? Where was it used? Who was it used by? Massive questions. And in terms of the SNP's future, if we take away from this particular issue over the party's finances, where are they? How are they doing under Humza Yousaf's leadership?
I think the problem is that this has rather dominated everything.
Well, absolutely.
Which is in fairness to him, he hasn't had a chance to really show what he will do as leader. What they've got to see off in Scotland is a Labour challenge. We've got a general election certainly within the next 18 months, could be a year, could be a lot sooner after what Boris Johnson has been up to. So what the SNP need to do is try and get themselves back on course again, because otherwise Labour will take them over.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Nigel Nelson there, our senior political commentator, taking us with the breaking news that Nicola Sturgeon has been arrested in the investigation into the SNP's finances. That's all for me. We have Nana Okoye coming up next.
Good afternoon, I'm Rory Smith in the GB newsroom. Well, as you've been hearing, Nicola Sturgeon has been arrested by police investigating